The wind in Dry Creek had teeth, and in late autumn, it bit with a particular vengeance. It was a bitter wind, born in the high passes of the Absaroka Range, and it scoured the valley floor, carrying a fine, salty dust that coated everything in a film of gray. It rattled the loose pane in the church steeple, making the bell toll with a dry, hollow clang that was less a call to prayer and more a warning. The sagebrush, brittle and skeletal, tumbled along the single-wide street, catching on porch posts and the wheels of abandoned wagons. This was Wyoming Territory in 1887, a place that wrung hope from a person like water from a stone. For May Caldwell, the wind was just one more thing to endure. She felt the town's gaze as a physical pressure, colder than any gust. A young widow at 24, daughter of the town's late blacksmith whose ambition had outstripped his luck, May was an island in a sea of hard-faced judgment. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. Rumors that she had given her heart to a Shoshone hunter, a man named Gray Elk, before he vanished into a blizzard 2 winters past. The town had no room for a love like that. They had twisted her grief into a stain, a mark of shame she was forced to wear every day. Now, her world had shrunk to the size of the small, drafty cabin she shared with her 12-year-old brother, Jamie, and the weary path she walked to the Copper Spur Saloon. There, she baked biscuits before dawn and washed the grime and sweat from the clothes of cowboys and prospectors, her hands raw from lye soap. It was a life measured in loaves of bread and buckets of water, a constant battle to keep the wolf of starvation from their door. On the far edge of this unforgiving town, where the prairie began its uninterrupted sweep toward the mountains, lived Luke Harper. He was a man who seemed to have been carved from the silence of the landscape itself. A former Army scout, he spoke little, his words chosen with the care of a man who knew their weight. He lived alone in a small, tidy bunkhouse with a gray gelding named Ash and a grizzled old dog called Scout, whose tail still managed a loyal thump against the floorboards whenever Luke entered. He took day work at the sprawling Everett outfit, a ranch run by Harlan Everett, a man whose wealth and influence made him the town's undeclared king. Harlan commanded not just cattle and land, but a band of rough riders who enforced his will, a self-styled militia that flew his brand. Luke kept to himself, a habit learned in times and places where notice from the wrong man could get you killed. He was patching a split in his saddle leather, the afternoon sun slanting low through the barn door, when his fingers brushed against a small object tucked deep in his canvas coat pocket. He pulled it out. It was a length of faded blue ribbon, soft as a sigh, the kind a girl might tie in her hair. He held it in his calloused palm for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before carefully tucking it away again. The memory it held was his alone. That same afternoon, a dry, racking cough echoed in the Caldwell cabin. Jamie lay on his cot, his face flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. May placed a damp cloth on his forehead, her heart a tight knot of fear. The cough had been getting worse for a week, and now it had a feverish heat behind it. She had no money for medicine. She had nothing left to sell, nothing except the last remnant of her old life. Her fingers trembled as she slid the thin gold band from her finger, her wedding ring, a plain, simple thing from a husband she had barely known, a boy who had died of a fever himself just 6 months into their marriage. It felt like a lifetime ago. The ring had been a promise of a different life, one of safety and belonging. Now, it was just gold. It was a handful of coins that could buy another day for her brother. Dr. Miller's pharmacy was a place of dark wood and strange, sharp smells. He peered at May over his spectacles, his lips a thin, disapproving line. He saw the ring on the counter, then looked at her face, and his expression hardened. "I am not in the business of taking charity. Mistress Caldwell," he said, his voice loud enough for the 2 women gossiping by the patent medicine display to hear. "This is not charity," May said, her voice quiet but firm, pushing the ring forward. "It is payment for medicine for my brother. He is sick." Dr. Miller pushed it back. "This town has certain standards. I will not be handling unclean money." The word struck May like a physical blow. Unclean. That is what she was to them. Tainted. Her face burned with shame, but her spine stiffened. She would not beg. She picked up the ring, her dignity a fragile shield, and turned to leave. The women by the display pointedly turned their backs. Outside, the wind howled, snatching the door from her hand and slamming it shut behind her. She walked blindly. Her vision blurred by tears she refused to let fall. She did not see the loose plank on the small wooden bridge over the dry creek bed until her foot caught, sending her stumbling forward. She cried out, flailing for balance, expecting to meet the hard, unforgiving ground. Instead, a strong hand caught her elbow, steadying her. She looked up into a pair of quiet gray eyes she recognized but did not know. It was Luke Harper. He said nothing. His grip was firm, impersonal, simply a fact. He had been walking on the opposite side of the street and had crossed when he saw her leaving the pharmacy. Before she could speak, he released her arm, walked past her into the pharmacy, and placed a few coins of his own on the counter. "The boy needs cough syrup and fever powder," he said to Dr. Miller. His voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable weight of command. Dr. Miller, who bowed and scraped before Harlan Everett, seemed to shrink before this quiet cowboy. He scurried to fill the order without a word of protest. Luke came back out, handing the small paper-wrapped package to May. He tipped his hat, a gesture so slight it was barely there, and turned, walking away down the dusty street, his long-legged stride eating up the ground. He did not wait for thanks. He did not even look back. That evening, the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls. May sat beside Jamie's bed, teaching him to read from their mother's tattered Bible, the only book they owned. His voice was hoarse as he sounded out the words, his small finger tracing the lines. "And the Lord said." May smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed her weary face. "That is right, Jamie. You are doing so well." She felt a surge of love for him so fierce it ached. He was all she had. He was the reason she endured the whispers, the cold shoulders, the biting wind. The truth of their situation was as stark as the landscape outside. Harlan Everett wanted their land, the small plot, with its reliable well. Sat directly in the path of a new grazing route he planned to cut through the valley. Her sullied reputation was the tool he used to pry her loose. He had put the word out, a quiet but deadly decree. No one was to hire May Caldwell for anything more than scraps. No one was to trade with her. No one was to speak to her. He was starving them out, and the town, in its fear and prejudice, was his willing accomplice. Later, after Jamie had finally fallen into a feverish sleep, May went outside to check on their old mare, Daisy. The wind had died down, and the silence was vast and unnerving. A full moon hung in the ink-black sky, bathing the valley in a pale, ghostly light. As she latched the door to the small horse shed, she noticed something odd, a set of boot prints in the dust, leading from the fence line to the back of the shed and then away. They were not hers, and they were too large to be Jamie's. Her heart began to beat a little faster. On the top rail of the fence, snagged on a splinter, was a small scrap of dark wool, torn from a heavy coat. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air crept over her. They were being watched. She hurried back inside, bolting the door. She stood for a long time in the dark, listening. There was only the sound of Jamie's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of her own heart. From his window, Jamie had seen it too, a tall shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows behind the shed. He had held his breath, too frightened to call out. He watched as the figure bent down and, with a stick or a knife, strew something in the dirt at the corner of the shed. Then the figure was gone, melting back into the darkness. When he was sure the man was gone, Jamie crept to the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peeked outside. In the moonlight, etched clearly in the dust, was a symbol. It was a horseshoe, crudely drawn but unmistakable. It was turned upside down. It was the mark of Harlan Everett's Dust Riders, a sign of bad luck, a threat. The day after the inverted horseshoe appeared in the dust was unnaturally still. The wind, that constant nagging voice of the valley, had fallen silent. A strange, yellowish haze leached the color from the sky, making the distant Absarokas look like a flat, painted backdrop. The air grew thick, heavy, tasting of grit and something ancient. In the fields, horses stood with their tails to the west, heads low, unmoving. Even Scout, Luke Harper's old dog, refused to leave the shade of the porch, whining low in his throat. May felt the stillness in her bones. It was a holding of breath, the kind that comes before a storm of unnatural power. She was hanging laundry on the line, the damp clothes refusing to dry in the humid air, when she saw it, a low, dark line on the western horizon. It was not the purple of a rainstorm, but a roiling, angry wall of reddish-brown that seemed to swallow the light. It was a duster, and it was moving with terrifying speed. Her first thought was for Jamie. She ran inside. "Jamie, get up! We have to go!" He was still weak from his fever, but the urgency in her voice got him to his feet. "What is it?" May. A storm. A bad one. She was already working, shoving a wooden bar across the inside of the door, forcing wedges of cloth into the gaps around the single window. The cabin was little more than a tinderbox, no match for a gale like the one she saw coming. "We are going to the church. It is the only place strong enough." She grabbed their mother's Bible and a jug of water, took Jamie's hand, and pulled him out into the eerie twilight. The first gust of wind hit them then, a solid wall of force that stole their breath and tore the bonnet from May's head. The world dissolved into a screaming chaos of sand and wind. The sun vanished. The sky turned the color of dried blood. Dry Creek descended into panic. Doors slammed, shutters banged against walls. Men shouted hoarsely, their words snatched away by the gale. May could barely see the building across the street. She tightened her grip on Jamie's hand, bent her head against the stinging onslaught, and fought her way forward. The fine dust was everywhere, in her eyes, her throat, her lungs. It felt as if the very prairie was rising up to smother them. Above the roar, the church bell began to toll, a wild, frantic clang as the wind battered the steeple. They stumbled up the steps of the church, their shoulders raw from the wind's assault. The heavy oak door was a bastion against the storm. May threw her weight against it, and they tumbled inside, into a space filled with other terrified townspeople. The air was thick with dust and fear. Faces were pale smudges in the gloom, eyes wide and white, and near the back, standing apart from the huddled groups, was Luke Harper. He stood as still as a mountain, his presence a calm anchor in the swirling anxiety of the room. He met May's eyes for a brief second, a flicker of acknowledgement, before turning his gaze back to the door, watching the storm. Suddenly, a heavy thud shook the door, followed by a desperate scratching. For a moment, everyone froze, thinking it was a branch or some other piece of debris. But it came again, a weak, human sound. Deputy Ruth Avery, a tall, stern woman with a practical face and hair the color of wheat, pushed her way to the front. She was the law in Dry Creek when the sheriff was napping, which was most of the time. With the help of another man, she heaved the great door open just enough to see what was there. A figure, silhouetted against the red gloom, stumbled through the opening and collapsed onto the floor. The man wore a tattered Union Army coat, dark with something more than dust. Ruth slammed the door shut against the storm's fury and knelt beside him, When she turned him over, a collective gasp went through the church. Ruth's own face went pale beneath its layer of grime. "Tom," she whispered, her voice cracking. It was Tom Avery, her younger brother. He was a wild one, known to ride with Harlan Everett's men, a constant source of trouble and heartbreak for his sister. Now he lay on the church floor, a dark stain spreading across his side, his breathing shallow and wet. They moved him to a pew, laying him down gently. He was fading fast, but his eyes were wide, filled with a desperate need to speak. He fumbled for Ruth's hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Ruth," he rasped, his voice a ghost in the howling wind. "You have to listen. Harlan, he sent me." His gaze drifted past his sister, landing on May, who stood frozen with Jamie clutching her skirts. It was not just a threat. The shed. He coughed, a terrible, rattling sound. "He wants the fire, a big fire. To blame you." He fixed his eyes on May. "Tomorrow, the barn dance." His words were cut short by a sound that was not the storm. It was a sharp, piercing crack, the unmistakable report of a rifle, fired from close by. In the fraction of a second that followed, a small, dark hole appeared in the wood of the heavy door, right at the height of a person's head. A splinter of oak exploded inwards. Time seemed to slow down. May was standing, mesmerized by the horror of Tom's words, directly in line with the door. But Luke Harper was not mesmerized. He moved with a swift, silent economy that was terrifying in its efficiency. He was not the quiet cowboy, the day laborer. He was the scout, the man who had survived war and wilderness. In 2 long strides, he was across the room. He did not shout a warning. He simply acted. His arm wrapped around May's waist, and he threw her and Jamie to the floorboards, shielding their bodies with his own. A fraction of a second later, a lead slug hissed through the space where May had been standing, burying itself with a solid thud in the wall behind the pulpit. Tom Avery's head fell back. His last breath escaped in a sigh that was lost in the ensuing chaos. The church erupted in screams. Women cried. Men shouted. But Luke was already on his feet. His pistol, a Colt Peacemaker, seeming to appear in his hand from nowhere. His face was a hard, cold mask. He looked at Ruth, who was staring at her dead brother, her own grief momentarily frozen by the attack. Their eyes met over the body, and in that silent glance, an understanding passed. Justice would not be found in a report filed with the sleeping sheriff. Together, they moved to the door. Luke pulled it open, and they plunged into the red hell of the storm. The wind tore at them, the sand blinding them. They could see no more than 10 feet in any direction. The shot had come from the direction of the livery stable. They ran, heads down, following an instinct for survival. They found tracks, deep in the dust, but they were already dissolving, erased by the wind as quickly as they were made. The gunman was a ghost. Then Ruth saw it, a flash of color in the monochrome chaos. Snagged on the sharp edge of a broken rain barrel was a piece of dark red silk. It was fine and expensive, the kind of thing no ordinary cowboy would wear. It was Harlan Everett's scarf, the one he wore knotted loosely around his neck like a lord displaying his colors. As Ruth reached for it, a vicious gust of wind ripped it free. It fluttered for a moment, a bloody banner in the storm, and then was gone, swallowed by the dust. They returned to the church, the taste of failure as bitter as the grit in their mouths. The storm was starting to abate, its roar fading to a low, mournful moan. The sheriff had been roused and had arrived, a portly man named Bo Miller, whose main concern seemed to be the bullet hole in the church wall. He looked down at Tom Avery's body, his expression one of weary annoyance. Ruth stood over her brother, her grief now a cold, hard stone in her chest. She had tried for years to pull him away from Harlan's influence, and now that influence had killed him. She looked at the faces of the townspeople. They were silent. They had seen what happened. They had heard the rifle shot. But their eyes were averted, refusing to meet hers, refusing to meet May's. Their silence was a weapon, one Harlan Everett used as skillfully as any gun. It was the same silence that had condemned May for months. As the last of the wind died down and a watery, dust-choked sun began to reappear, May gathered Jamie to go home. Their cabin would be filled with a fine layer of red dust, a reminder of the day's terror. Before she could leave, Ruth stopped her, drawing her into the quiet of the bell tower entrance. "He wanted me to have this," Ruth said, her voice low and tight with suppressed rage. From her pocket, she pulled a crumpled, dirt-stained piece of paper and carefully unfolded it. She had found it clutched in Tom's hand. It was a receipt from the general store, dated 2 days prior. On it, in the storekeeper's careful script, was a single item, 10 gallons of kerosene, at the bottom, where a signature was required for such a large purchase on credit, was the scrawled name of Jed, one of Harlan's most loyal and brutal riders. Ruth looked up from the paper, her eyes boring into May's. "The whole town has been planning this barn dance for a month," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A fundraiser?" "Harlan has been so generous, donating the use of his new barn." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "That barn, May, it stands not 100 yards from your property line." The dust storm left Dry Creek with a clean, raw feeling, as if a layer of skin had been scoured away. The air was crisp, the sky a piercing blue, and the townspeople emerged from their homes with a nervous energy, eager to wash away the memory of the red gloom. They threw themselves into preparations for the barn dance with a feverish intensity. Women hung quilts and paper lanterns from the rafters of Harlan Everett's new barn, and the sound of hammering and laughter echoed across the valley. Harlan himself was the very picture of civic leadership. He rode through town on his big bay horse, overseeing the delivery of cider barrels, nodding graciously to the ladies, and clapping men on the back. He was washing the town in his generosity, a public baptism to cleanse the ugly rumors that clung to his name like the dust had clung to their clothes, underneath the festive surface. However, another current was flowing. Harlan stopped at the blacksmith's, at the general store, at the small homesteads, a sheaf of papers in his saddlebag. He spoke of community, of progress, of a shared future, and then he would produce the land agreements, his voice dropping to a confidential, persuasive murmur. "Sign here," he would say, "and be part of Dry Creek's bright new tomorrow." Few had the courage to refuse. May Caldwell watched it all from her window, the receipt from Tom Avery's pocket a cold weight in her apron. The barn dance was a trap, a stage set for her final, public ruin. Her first instinct was to bar the door, to hide with Jamie until the whole terrible night had passed. But as she watched Harlan charm the very people who shunned her, a slow, hot anger began to burn away her fear. They would dance and laugh on the edge of her destruction, and she would not even be there to look them in the eye. That evening, as she mended a tear in Jamie's only good shirt, he looked at her with an unnerving perception. "You are going, are you not?" "To the dance? Of course not. Jamie, it is no place for us." Why, he pressed, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "Because they will whisper, they already whisper. Are you going to let them hide you in your own home forever Pa would not have hidden?" The words, so simple and true, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her father, for all his failed ambitions, had never once backed down from a challenge. He had faced his ruin with his head held high. She looked at her one good dress, a simple blue calico her mother had made, hanging on a peg on the wall. It was clean and pressed, but she knew the left shoe that went with it had a loose heel, a wobble that would make dancing impossible even if, by some miracle, she were asked. "You are right," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "I cannot hide." Deputy Ruth Avery, meanwhile, was not hiding. She walked into Sheriff Miller's office with a determined stride. the kerosene receipt and the scrap of red silk laid out on his cluttered desk. A man was murdered in that church. "Bo," she said, her voice flat and even. "Shot from ambush. My brother was trying to deliver a warning, and this receipt proves Harlan Everett's man was planning something with 10 gallons of fuel." The sheriff sighed, a long, weary sound, and leaned back in his chair until it groaned in protest. He polished his spectacles with a corner of his vest. Ruth, Tom lived a hard life. He rode with a hard crowd. He met a hard end. It is a tragedy, but it is not a conspiracy. This is a receipt for kerosene. People use kerosene. And a piece of cloth, the wind was blowing a gale. It could have come from anywhere. It came from Harlan's scarf. Ruth insisted, and Tom was warning May Caldwell. This dance is a pretext. "Stop," the sheriff said, holding up a plump hand. "Just stop. Harlan Everett is the biggest landowner in this territory. He is practically the only reason this town has a payroll. You are asking me to accuse him of murder on the word of a dying troublemaker and a piece of laundry. Let it lie. Ruth, for the good of the town, do not go making waves." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, turning his attention to a stack of wanted posters as if she were no longer there. The next day, May walked to the Copper Spur Saloon, a basket of freshly baked biscuits on her arm. The smell of yeast and warm bread was one of the few comforts she had. The saloon's owner, a burly man named Silas, took the basket without meeting her eye. "Just leave them on the counter," he grunted, already turning away. He paused, his back to her. "And May, I would not be showing my face at that dance tonight. If I were you, it is a private affair. For folks who belong." The casual cruelty of his words locked the air in her lungs. She turned and walked out, her back straight, her head high, the coins he'd left on the counter feeling as dirty as Dr. Miller had claimed her ring was. On the other side of town, Luke Harper was mending a fence line on the Everett property. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, his movements precise. As he worked, an elderly Shoshone woman approached, walking slowly from the direction of the river. She was leading a young girl who was coughing, a dry, painful sound that echoed Jamie's illness. The woman did not speak English, but her gestures were clear. She pointed to the girl, then to her own chest, then toward the town. She needed medicine. She offered Luke a small, beaded pouch. He shook his head gently, not wanting her payment. He led her not to the town, but to a small, sheltered bend in the creek bed, where different plants grew in the damp soil. He knelt, his large hands surprisingly deft as he gathered specific leaves and roots. He recognized them from his time as a scout, remedies the local tribes had used for generations. He crushed a few leaves between his fingers, the sharp, clean scent rising in the air. He handed the bundle of herbs to the old woman, using a few words of her own tongue that he still remembered. He demonstrated how to boil them into a tea for the girl. The woman's worried face broke into a grateful smile. She pressed a small, smooth river stone into his hand and then led the girl away. Luke watched them go, the stone warm in his palm. He understood there was more than one kind of law in this valley, and more than one kind of medicine. That afternoon, when May returned from gathering firewood, she saw a small, brown paper box sitting on her front step. There was no name on it. Cautiously, she picked it up and brought it inside. Her heart beat a little faster as she untied the simple string. Inside, nestled in a bit of clean cloth, was her blue shoe. She picked it up. The wobbly heel was gone. In its place was a solid, expertly repaired base, the new leather seamlessly joined to the old, secured with tiny, perfect stitches and small, headless nails. It was the work of someone who knew leather, someone with strong, patient hands. She knew, with a certainty that had no need for proof, who had left it. She thought of the quiet cowboy who had bought Jamie's medicine and then walked away, the man who had shielded her from a bullet without a word. A warmth spread through her chest. a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it. It was hope. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The first strains of a fiddle drifted on the evening air from Harlan's barn. It was time. Just as she was pinning up her hair, there was a quiet knock at the door. It was Ruth, her face grim, her deputy's star gleaming dully in the twilight. She did not waste time with greetings. "I went back to the barn," she said, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "I told the sheriff I was doing a final security check. He just laughed. Her eyes were dark with what she had found. "I was checking the floorboards near the back, by the hay storage. One of them was loose. I pried it up." She took a shaky breath. "May, they are not just planning a fire, they are planning an inferno. There are barrels under the floor. Kerosene, at least 4 of them. They mean to set it ablaze while everyone is drunk and distracted by the music." Ruth looked at May, her expression a mixture of fury and despair. "And when that whole barn goes up in flames, with half the town inside, they're going to tell everyone it was you." The barn was an island of golden light and sound in the vast, dark prairie. Kerosene lamps, hung from the high rafters, cast a warm, flickering glow on the spinning couples, their shadows long and distorted. The air was thick with the scent of hay, sawdust, and sweet apple cider. A trio of fiddlers sawed away in the corner, their music a lively, foot-stomping rhythm that vibrated up through the worn floorboards. Laughter, loud and uninhibited, rose to the ceiling. For one night, the hardscrabble people of Dry Creek were determined to forget the dust, the wind, and the quiet desperation that marked their days. May stood at the edge of the wide-open doors, a silhouette against the moonlit night. Jamie stood beside her, his hand clutching hers, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had walked here with a fire in her heart, a righteous anger fueled by Ruth's discovery. But now, faced with the wall of noise and light, her courage wavered. This was their world, and she was an outsider. Every smiling face was a face that had turned away from her in the street. Every laughing voice was a voice that had whispered behind her back. She took a breath, the borrowed hope from the mended shoe, a small, steady flame inside her. She straightened her shoulders and stepped over the threshold, Jamie following a half-step behind. It happened just as she had known it would. A fiddler missed a note. A laugh was cut short. The swirling motion of the dancers faltered as, one by one, they saw her. A silence, sudden and complete, fell over the barn. It was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the scrape of a boot on the floor. Then, the whispers began. They started at the edges of the room and spread inward like a contagion, a sibilant rush of judgment. Eyes, hard and curious and cold, fixed on her. The men who had been laughing and preening for the town's eligible daughters now looked at her as if she were a rattler coiled by the punch bowl. Across the room, Harlan Everett stood with a group of ranchers, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He saw her, and a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He made no move to silence the whispers. He savored them. He raised his glass in a mock toast, his eyes gleaming with triumph in the lamplight. This was his stage, and she was playing the part he had written for her, the outcast, the pariah. The music stuttered back to life, but the carefree spirit was gone. The dancers moved with a self-conscious stiffness, their eyes darting toward the woman in the simple blue dress who stood alone by the door. No one approached her. No one spoke to her. She was invisible and yet the center of all attention, a ghost at the feast. She could feel the color rising in her cheeks, a hot tide of shame. Jamie's hand tightened in hers. She wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of her small cabin and bolt the door against their hatred. But then she remembered the kerosene. She remembered Tom Avery's last, desperate words. This was not just a party. It was a battlefield. And so she stood her ground, her chin held high, meeting their stares with a quiet defiance that infuriated them more than any outburst could have. The fiddlers finished their tune with a flourish. There was scattered applause. The lead fiddler, a man with a long, drooping mustache, wiped his brow and announced, "Time for a waltz, folks. Grab your partners." The slow, melodic strains of a waltz filled the barn. It was a beautiful, yearning sound, full of grace and longing. The floor filled again, men bowing to their chosen partners, women curtsying. Soon, the room was a gentle, swirling eddy of couples, moving as one to the lilting 1-2-3 rhythm. And May stood utterly alone. The space around her seemed to grow, a wide, empty circle that set her apart from everyone else. The humiliation was a physical thing now, a sharp pain in her chest. She had made her stand, and she had lost. She was a fool to have come. She was about to turn, to gather Jamie and retreat into the night, when a figure detached itself from the shadows near the far wall. It was Luke Harper. He moved with that same unhurried purpose she had seen before. He was not wearing his dusty work clothes, but a clean shirt and trousers. He walked straight toward her, his eyes never leaving her face. The dancers near his path slowed, their turns becoming clumsy as they watched him. He did not seem to notice. He walked through the whispers and the stares as if they were nothing more than smoke. He stopped in front of her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, and in his quiet gray eyes she saw not pity, but a deep and unwavering respect. He reached up and slowly removed his hat, holding it in his hand. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the music and the murmurs with the clarity of a bell. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the townspeople, over Harlan Everett's tightening sneer. No man would dance with her, he asked, a simple question that was also an accusation. He turned his eyes back to May, and a hint of something she had never seen before, a quiet warmth, softened their intensity. "I have been waiting my whole life." He held out his hand. May stared at it, a strong, calloused hand that had mended her shoe, that had pulled her from the floor of the church. Her heart was hammering so loudly she was sure the whole room could hear it. She looked up at his face, at the sincerity etched in the lines around his eyes, and the dam of her composure finally broke. A single tear traced a path through the fine layer of dust on her cheek. She placed her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm and steady. He led her to the center of the floor, into the empty space that had been her prison. He placed one hand on her waist and took her other hand in his, and they began to dance. The town of Dry Creek watched, utterly astounded. This was more than a dance. It was a declaration. The quiet cowboy, the man who kept to himself, was drawing a line in the dust, and he was standing on May Caldwell's side of it. From his place by the wall, Harlan Everett's eyes narrowed to slits, the whiskey in his glass forgotten, unseen by the transfixed crowd. Ruth Avery, her face a mask of grim resolve, slipped out a side door into the darkness, a small crowbar tucked into the waistband of her skirt. At first, Luke was clumsy. He was a man more accustomed to the rhythm of a horse than a waltz. He counted his steps with a grim focus, his movements stiff. May felt a bubble of genuine laughter rise in her throat, startling her. She leaned in closer, her voice a soft whisper against his ear. "You count 1, 2, 3, she murmured, "not 1, 4, 7. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He looked down at their feet, then back at her. "I only just learned there were 3 cows in the barn," he answered, his voice a dry rumble. She smiled, a real, radiant smile, and the tension in his shoulders eased. She began to guide him, her body swaying with the music, her hand light on his shoulder. He followed her lead, and soon their steps found the rhythm. They were no longer 2 separate people, but a single unit, turning gracefully in the warm lamplight. They did not speak again. They did not need to. In the circle of his arms, surrounded by a hostile world, May felt a profound sense of peace. The shame, the fear, the loneliness, all of it melted away, leaving only the steady beat of the music and the solid presence of the man who held her. It was a feeling that went far beyond gratitude. It was the first stirrings of a connection so deep it frightened her. The last notes of the waltz hung in the air, sweet and sad. For a moment, they remained as they were, in the center of the silent room. Then, slowly, Luke released her and stepped back, nodding his head once in a gesture of profound respect. The spell was broken. A nervous cough sounded from the crowd. And then a new smell cut through the air. It was not hay or cider. It was the sharp, acrid scent of smoke. A woman screamed. All heads turned toward the back of the barn, where a thin gray tendril of smoke was curling from beneath the door of the hay storeroom. In seconds, the tendril became a plume, then a thick, choking cloud. Panic erupted. People shouted and scrambled for the main doors. A terrified mob pushing and shoving. Harlan Everett's voice rose above the din, his face a mask of feigned horror. "It is her," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at May. "She is the one. The woman brings nothing but bad luck." Luke ignored him. His eyes scanned the chaos and found Jamie, who was frozen with terror near the wall. In an instant, Luke scooped the boy into his arms and charged not for the front entrance, but for the smaller rear door used for loading supplies. He reached it and threw his shoulder against the wood. It did not budge. "It is wedged," he yelled. May's mind, which had been floating in a daze, snapped into focus. She saw Ruth reappear from the side of the barn, her face streaked with soot. Their eyes met in a flash of understanding. This was it. Someone had set a different fire. While everyone watched the dance, a second plan had been put into motion. Water May screamed. Grabbing one of the decorative cider buckets from a table, Ruth seized another. Together, they ran toward the smoke, toward the fire. As the panicked citizens of Dry Creek scrambled to save themselves, the wind, which had been a quiet spectator for most of the evening, roared back to life as if summoned by the smoke. It howled around the corners of the barn, feeding the fire with greedy gulps of air. The flames, which had been a controllable threat in the storeroom, exploded outward with a hungry whoosh, licking at the dry timber of the main walls. The festive paper lanterns ignited, falling in fiery pieces onto the dance floor. The heat was a physical blow, driving the screaming crowd back toward the single point of escape at the front, while May and Ruth threw useless bucketfuls of water against the growing inferno, their faces streaked with soot and their lungs burning. Luke put Jamie down and examined the jammed rear door. A heavy wooden wagon tongue had been wedged diagonally between the door frame and a support post, a simple but brutally effective trap. With the calm precision of a man dismantling a weapon, Luke found a leverage point. He braced his shoulders against the wall, his muscles cording in his back and arms. With a great, grunting heave, the timber groaned and shifted. He strained again, and the tongue scraped free, clattering to the floor. He wrenched the door open. "This way," he bellowed, his voice a raw command that cut through the panic. "Out the back. Move." He and Ruth began to direct the terrified townspeople, pushing them through the opening and out into the cold night air. The orderly evacuation quickly turned into a stampede, but they held their ground, a small island of order in the chaos. May continued her frantic, hopeless battle with the buckets, joined by a few other brave souls, trying to slow the fire's spread toward the main support beams. It was in a brief, terrible lull, as she was refilling her bucket at the cider barrel, that she saw him through a small, grimy window on the far side of the barn, a window meant for ventilation. She saw a figure scrambling out. It was Harlan Everett. While he had been shouting for others to save themselves, he had been securing his own escape, avoiding the crush of the crowd he had helped create. As he dropped to the ground outside, something small and metallic fell from his coat pocket. landing in a patch of early snow that the fire's heat had not yet melted. He did not seem to notice. He brushed himself off and vanished into the darkness. Something compelled May to move. She abandoned her bucket and worked her way along the inside wall of the barn, the heat blistering the side of her face. She reached the small window and peered out. There, glinting in the hellish orange light of the fire, lay the object. It was a brass seal, the kind used for impressing wax on important documents. She recognized the ornate E of the Everett Outfit brand. She looked closer. The object was not just lying in the snow. It was stuck to it, and a sticky, amber substance coated its base. It smelled sharp and resinous, like pine sap, a fire starter, the proof. By now, the last of the townspeople were clear. The roof was beginning to groan, threatening to collapse. May Luke's voice was a lifeline. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the rear exit just as a flaming rafter crashed down where she had been standing. They stumbled out into the yard, a surreal landscape of orange light and black shadows. The ground was a mess of trampled snow and spreading ash. The evacuees were a huddled, coughing mass, their faces upturned, watching in horror as the barn, the symbol of their festive night, was consumed by flames. And there, standing apart from them, flanked by 4 of his most loyal men, was Harlan Everett. He was watching the fire with a look of grim satisfaction. Ruth Avery saw him too. Her face, already a mask of grief and fury, hardened into granite. She strode toward him, her movements stiff with rage. "You did this," she said, her voice low and shaking. "You murdered my brother, and you set this fire." Harlan laughed. A short, ugly sound. "The deputy has lost her senses. Grief can do that. It was this woman," he said, pointing a finger at May. "She brought this curse upon us all." That was when May pushed forward. Her hand clenched so tightly around the brass seal that the edges cut into her palm. "You lie," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the cold air. "You dropped this when you climbed out the window." She opened her hand. The seal lay there, damning and irrefutable, the sticky pine resin glistening. "You set the fire yourself." A collective murmur went through the crowd. Their fear was beginning to be replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. For a fraction of a second, Harlan's composure broke. A flicker of pure fury crossed his face. Then the mask of the community leader slammed back into place. But Ruth had seen it. She drew her pistol, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. She leveled it at Harlan's chest. "It is over, Harlan," she said. His 4 men immediately drew their own weapons, creating a tense, deadly circle. Luke moved to stand beside May, placing himself between her and the armed men. He gently pushed Jamie behind him. He did not draw his own gun. He simply stood there, his presence a solid, unmovable fact. His eyes were fixed on Harlan. "There has been enough blood tonight," he said, his voice quiet but resonant with authority. Harlan sneered, his confidence returning as he looked at his armed riders. "Blood. This is justice. That woman is a disgrace to this town, a stain we need to wash clean. And this man," he spat, gesturing toward Luke, "is nothing but a hired killer, a man who lives by the gun. They belong together, in the dirt." The crowd shifted uneasily, their loyalties swaying like grass in the wind. They were afraid of Harlan, but the evidence in May's hand was undeniable. May felt a tremor run through her, a lifetime of fear and shame threatening to overwhelm her. But then she felt the solid warmth of Luke's presence beside her, and she looked at the faces in the crowd, faces that had judged her without knowing her. The anger returned, clean and pure, burning away the fear. "A disgrace," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength with every word. "Is it a disgrace to love someone? Yes, I loved Gray Elk. He was a good and gentle man. He taught me the names of the stars and how to find water where there was none. And when he was lost in the blizzard, you did not see my grief. You only saw a chance to whisper, to turn my sorrow into something ugly, something you could use to feel better about your own small lives. Her gaze swept across them, unflinching. You have been feeding on my shame for 2 years. Tonight, Harlan Everett tried to use it to burn you all alive, and you were ready to let him. The truth in her words struck the crowd with the force of a physical blow. People looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Ruth stepped forward, her gun still steady. She is telling the truth. I have the receipt for 10 gallons of kerosene, signed by Harlan's man. I found the barrels myself, under the floorboards. And the bullet that killed my brother, the one that nearly killed Mistress Caldwell, was fired from a Sharps rifle, a .50 caliber round. Not a common weapon around here, but I know for a fact that 3 of the men who served with Harlan in the war were issued them, men who now ride for the Everett brand. A heavy silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the dying fire. The town was holding its breath. Sheriff Bo Miller finally pushed his way through the crowd. He looked from Ruth's gun to Harlan's cold face, his own expression a miserable conflict of duty and fear. "Now, Ruth," he began, his voice placating, "let's not be hasty. Put the firearm down. We can sort this all out in the morning." He reached out, his hand moving slowly toward her pistol. For a moment, it seemed she would let him take it. The law, weak as it was reasserting itself. But then, in a move that stunned everyone, Sheriff Miller's hand bypassed Ruth's gun entirely. His own Colt appeared in his fist, and he leveled it not at Ruth, but directly at Harlan Everett. "No," the sheriff said, his voice surprisingly firm. "I think we will sort it out right now. I'm tired of sorting things out in the morning. Harlan, I am tired of looking the other way while you squeeze this town dry. I am tired of burying your secrets." He took a deep breath, the confession of a man unburdening a lifetime of cowardice. "I have known for a long time what you are, and I will not let you add this night's work to your list." The crowd gasped. The balance of power had shattered. Harlan's men looked uncertainly from the sheriff to their boss, their own loyalty wavering in the face of the law's sudden, unexpected spine. Harlan's face was a mask of disbelief, which quickly curdled into pure, unrestrained rage. He was trapped. The town, his town, was turning on him. Just as it seemed the standoff had reached its conclusion, a new sound intruded. It was faint at first, then grew rapidly louder, a rhythmic, drumming thunder that was not the fire. It was the sound of dozens of horses, ridden hard. Over the crest of the nearby hill, a line of riders appeared, dark silhouettes against the starry sky. They carried torches, their flames whipping in the wind. The Dust Riders, Harlan's private army. A wild, triumphant look flashed across Harlan's face. "You are too late!" "Sheriff," he roared. He turned to his riders. Take them all!" Chaos erupted again, but Luke was already moving. He was not waiting for the fight. He grabbed May's hand, pulling her along. "Jamie, with me!" he commanded. The Dust Riders were charging down the hill, a wave of fire and steel about to crash over them. There was no escape back toward the town. There was only one direction left to go. He pulled them past the smoldering ruins of the barn, away from the shouting and confusion, running hard toward the dark, silent expanse of the river, its surface a sheet of black ice under the winter moon. He was a scout once more, with a desperate plan for survival, a gamble against the unforgiving nature of the wild. The thunder of hooves grew behind them, a terrifying, rolling drumbeat that seemed to shake the frozen ground. Luke did not look back. His focus was entirely forward, on the glint of moonlight on the vast, treacherous sheet of the river. The air was frigid, burning their lungs, and each puff of their breath was a white plume of panic in the night. May's hand was locked in his, and she held Jamie's hand with her other, forming a desperate human chain against the encroaching darkness. They reached the riverbank, a steep, stony slope leading down to the ice. The horses of the Dust Riders were close now, their snorts and the jingle of their harnesses audible over the dying roar of the distant fire. Luke did not hesitate. He scrambled down the bank, his boots finding purchase where May was sure there was none. He stopped at the edge of the ice, releasing her hand. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice low and steady. He found a long, thick branch of dead cottonwood lying on the bank, heavy and solid. Using it as a staff, he took a single, deliberate step onto the ice. A deep, groaning crack shot out from under his boot, a black spiderweb against the pale surface. He froze, listening, feeling the vibrations through the soles of his boots. He took another step, then another, tapping the ice in front of him with a staff, listening to the pitch of the sound it made. A sharp, high ring meant solid ice. A dull, hollow thud meant danger. He worked his way out 10 feet, then turned back. The first of the dust riders were appearing on the bank above, their torches casting a hellish, dancing light. "It is thin, but it will hold if we are careful," Luke called out, his voice never rising. "It is a shallow crossing here. The current is slower. May, you come first. Jamie, you hold to her coat. Walk only where I walk. Single file. Do not run." May nodded, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She helped Jamie down the slope and took her first tentative step onto the ice, her eyes fixed on the dark boot prints Luke had left. The river groaned beneath her, a terrible, living sound. It felt as if they were walking on a pane of glass suspended over a black, bottomless abyss. Luke began to walk backward, facing them, tapping the ice methodically with his staff. Tap, step, tap, step. "Follow the taps," he said, his voice a calm anchor in her fear. "Just watch my feet and listen to the sound." Behind them, Harlan Everett reined in his horse at the top of the bank, his face a mask of fury in the torchlight. "They are on the ice after them. $100 for the man who brings me the cowboy's head." A few of the riders hesitated, their horses skittish at the edge of the groaning ice, but most were too loyal, or too afraid of Harlan, to disobey. They urged their mounts down the slope, the iron-shod hooves skittering on the stones. The first horse stepped onto the ice, and a network of new cracks crazed the surface. "Faster," Luke urged, his voice still low, but now laced with a desperate urgency. They were halfway across. The shouts of the men behind them were closer, the drumming of hooves now a terrifying, immediate presence on the ice itself. The whole river seemed to be moaning in protest. May could feel the surface shifting, swaying sickeningly under her feet. Jamie stumbled, and she caught him, pulling him upright, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. A rider, a brutish man named Jed, whose name was on the kerosene receipt, grew impatient. He raised his pistol, aiming not at Luke, but at the ice in front of them. "Stop them!" he roared, and fired. The gunshot was deafening in the cold. Still air, the bullet did not hit them. It struck the ice 10 feet to their right with a loud smack. The impact was all it took. The delicate web of cracks exploded. With a sound like a cannon shot, a huge section of the ice fractured, tilted, and gave way. It was not May or Jamie or Luke who had been in the path of the collapsing ice. It was Harlan Everett. He had been riding at the forefront of the pursuit, his face contorted with rage. One moment he was on his horse, a figure of absolute power. The next, the world fell out from under him. His horse screamed as it went down, and Harlan was thrown from the saddle, landing on the jagged edge of the ice before sliding with a shocked cry into the black, churning water. The shock of the cold was so intense it stole his breath. He surfaced, gasping, his arms flailing, his eyes wide with a terror that was no longer feigned. The current was swift, immediately pulling him toward the solid sheet of ice downstream, threatening to drag him under. The pursuit came to a chaotic halt. The dust riders stared, horrified, as their leader fought for his life. Luke, May, and Jamie had reached the far bank. They were safe. They could have kept running. No one would have blamed them. But Luke did not run. He turned and watched for a single, long moment as Harlan struggled. May saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a deep, weary sorrow. He had seen enough death. He had caused enough death. This was not how justice was meant to feel. He uncoiled the lariat from his belt, the rope he used for his work, for his life. With a flick of his wrist, he sent the loop snaking out over the water. It landed perfectly, right beside Harlan's thrashing arms. "Grab it!" Luke yelled. Harlan's pride, his hatred, was so great that for a second he seemed to refuse. But the deadly cold was seeping into his bones, his limbs growing heavy. His survival instinct won. His frozen fingers closed around the rope. Luke dug his heels into the frozen mud of the bank and began to pull, his muscles straining. May rushed to his side, adding her small weight to the effort. Slowly, hand over hand, they began to drag the sputtering, cursing man from the water. "I will see you hang for this," Harlan choked, water pouring from his mouth. Even in his desperation, his voice was filled with venom. "You and that woman, I will burn your whole world to the ground." Luke just kept pulling, his face a grim, determined mask. He was saving the man's life, but he would not grant him the dignity of a response. Jed, the man who had fired the shot, saw his master's life hanging by a thread, and in his twisted loyalty, he saw only one cause for it all. He raised his pistol again, his arm steadying, the barrel aligning directly with May's back. He never fired. A second gunshot, sharper and cleaner than his own, rang out from the opposite bank. Jed grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and crumpled from his saddle, his pistol falling onto the ice. Ruth Avery stood on the far bank, her pistol still smoking in her hand. Sheriff Miller stood beside her, his own gun drawn. A small posse of shaken but determined townspeople behind them. They had not fled, they had followed. The sudden shot, the shift in weight as Jed fell, the shock of it all was too much. The rope, slick with ice and water, slipped through Harlan's numb fingers. His eyes widened in a final moment of disbelief. He made a desperate grab, his hand closing on nothing but icy air. Then the current took him. He was pulled down, under the dark shelf of ice, and was gone. The black water swirled once, and then was still. The river had passed its own judgment. A stunned silence fell over the two banks, broken only by the whimpering of Harlan's horse as it struggled to pull itself from the water. The dust riders looked at their fallen comrade, at their vanished leader, and then at the armed sheriff and the grim-faced deputy. The fight went out of them. A few turned their horses and fled into the night. The rest slowly, reluctantly, raised their hands in surrender. It was over. May stood staring at the black water, her body trembling uncontrollably. The terror of the last hour, the last months, washed over her in a great, shuddering wave. She turned, her eyes finding Luke's. He was coiling his rope, his movements slow and tired. He looked up and saw her, and the hard mask on his face softened. She did not think. She simply moved. She crossed the few feet of frozen ground between them and threw her arms around him, burying her face in the rough canvas of his coat. She clung to him, not in passion, but in a desperate, overwhelming need for the simple, solid fact of his existence. He stood stiffly for a moment, surprised. Then his arms came around her, holding her gently, protectively. They stood like that for a long time, two solitary figures on a dark riverbank, their breath mingling in a single white cloud in the cold, uncaring wind. Finally, the tremors subsided. She pulled back, embarrassed by her own forwardness. As she did, something small and soft was dislodged from his coat pocket where she'd been pressing against him. It fell without a sound, landing on the dark. Snow dusted ice at their feet. It was a small length of faded blue ribbon. May's breath caught in her throat. She knew that ribbon. She had worn it in her hair 4 years ago, on market day. She had been a girl then, 16 years old, her heart full of foolish dreams. A gust of wind had snatched it from her hair, and she had cried out in dismay as it fluttered away. lost in the busy street. She looked from the ribbon on the ice up to Luke's face. He was watching her, his expression unguarded, vulnerable. And in that moment, she understood the mended shoe, the medicine, the quiet watchfulness she had sometimes felt but never identified. And his words, the ones that had silenced a room full of hatred, echoed in her mind with a new and breathtaking meaning. I have been waiting my whole life. He had not just been waiting for a dance, he had been waiting for her. The weeks that followed the fire were a time of quiet and profound change for Dry Creek. The first snows of winter fell, a soft white blanket that covered the ashes of the barn and the ugliness of the past, making the valley clean and new again. The town, shaken from its fearful slumber, seemed to take its first collective breath of free air. Men spoke to one another in the street without looking over their shoulders. Women stopped their whispering and started talking. The half-burned shell of Harlan's barn was not torn down. Instead, the townspeople, led by the new blacksmith who was only too happy to be free of Harlan's thumb, came together to repair it. They salvaged the good timber, raised new rafters, and laid a new floor. It was no longer the Everett barn. It was the town's barn, a place consecrated by fire and truth. It was here, in the rebuilt structure that still smelled of fresh-cut pine, that the town held its reckoning. It was not a formal trial with a judge and jury, but a public meeting, a clearing of the air for all to witness. The room was packed, the townspeople standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces serious and attentive. Ruth Avery stood at the front, no longer just a deputy, but the clear moral authority of the town. She did not raise her voice. She simply laid out the evidence she had gathered: the kerosene receipt, the brass seal sticky with pine resin, the testimony of the men who had been with her when she discovered the barrels. She presented it all with a calm, irrefutable logic. Then Sheriff Bo Miller stood up, his bulk seeming somehow smaller, his face humbled. He spoke of the years of intimidation, of looking the other way, of the small compromises that had led to a great evil. He publicly attested to the evidence Ruth presented and confessed his own cowardice. It was not an excuse, but an explanation, and the town listened in sober silence. One by one, the other ranchers and business owners, the men who had signed Harlan's land agreements, stood and renounced them. They tore the documents in half, a symbolic act of severing their ties to the old ways. A fund was established, a collection of coins and bills, to offer compensation. It was a clumsy, imperfect form of justice, but it was real. May was given enough to repair her cabin and buy new tools for her father's old forge. And a new treaty was drawn up with the Shoshone elders, guaranteeing them access to their ancestral fishing grounds along the river, grounds Harlan had illegally fenced off. It was not everything, but it was a beginning. Life settled into a new rhythm. May, no longer the town pariah, found her biscuits and pies in high demand. She set up a small stall at the weekly market, the scent of cinnamon and baking bread drawing a steady stream of customers. People who had once shunned her now met her eye, a quiet apology in their gaze. They bought her goods not out of pity, but because they were the best in the valley. And Jamie, his cough long gone and his spirit bright, began an apprenticeship with the new blacksmith, his thin arms slowly gaining muscle as he learned to shape hot iron, his laughter a frequent sound ringing from the forge. Luke Harper, true to his nature, remained on the edge of things. He took his day wages and kept to himself, but the town now looked at him with a mixture of awe and profound respect. One afternoon, he rode out of town leading his spare horse, a good, strong buckskin. He returned 2 days later without it. That evening, he knocked on May's door. He held out a folded piece of paper. It was the deed to her family's land, bought and paid for from the sale of his horse. The names on the deed were May Caldwell and Jamie Caldwell. His own name was nowhere to be found. May looked at the paper, then up at his face, her heart too full for words. This quiet man, who spoke so little, had given her back her home, her security, her future. He had asked for nothing in return, A few nights later, a cold wind was rattling the windows of the cabin. May saw the light of a lantern in her small horse shed. She pulled on a shawl and went out, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. She found Luke inside, tending to his horse, Ash. The shed was warm, filled with the sweet, clean smell of hay and the comfortable sounds of a horse munching its oats. She noticed a long, angry scratch on his forearm, red and inflamed, a souvenir from when he had wrenched the wagon tongue from the jammed barn door. "That looks sore," she said softly. "You should let me clean it." He stopped grooming the horse but did not object. She went back to the cabin and returned with a bowl of warm water, clean cloths, and a small tin of antiseptic salve. He sat on an overturned bucket, and she knelt before him, gently washing the grime from the wound. His arm was corded with muscle, the skin weathered by sun and wind. Her touch was light, careful. They did not speak for a long time, content in the quiet intimacy of the moment, the lantern casting a gentle, golden glow around them. "The whole town is grateful to you," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head slightly. "I did not do it for the town." She finished cleaning the wound and began to apply the salve, her fingers cool on his warm skin. She smiled, a small, private smile. "Have you gotten any better at counting your steps?" For the first time since she had met him, a true smile broke across Luke's face. It was a rare, wonderful thing, like seeing a desert flower bloom after a rain. It reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. "I have practiced," he said, his voice a low, rumbling sound that was almost a laugh. "I can count all the way to a lifetime now." His words hung in the warm air between them. A lifetime. He had been waiting his whole life. He had been counting the steps until he reached her. She finished her work and looked up at him, her heart aching with a tenderness that was both new and ancient. He looked down at her, his smile fading into something more serious, more profound. He reached out, not to touch her face or her hair, but simply to take her hand, his fingers wrapped around hers, his calluses rough against her skin. It was not a gesture of passion, but of deep, unspoken connection. They sat like that, hand in hand, listening to the wind outside and the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. She thought of them on the ice, the 3 steps he had taught her to take, the waltz of survival. 1, 2, 3, so the ice would not break. He had led her then, just as he had led her on the dance floor. He had led her out of the darkness. Slowly, she leaned forward. He met her halfway. Their first kiss was as light and gentle as frost settling on a window pane. It was hesitant, questioning, a soft press of lips that held no demand, only a deep and abiding respect. It was the quiet culmination of a lifetime of waiting, a promise sealed not with fire, but with the simple, trusting warmth of a winter's night in a stable. When they parted, neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed to be said. The next day, as Luke was leaving the general store, Ruth Avery stopped him. She had a new, shiny star pinned to her coat. The town council had officially made her the sheriff. She looked tired but content. A woman who had found her purpose. "I need a man I can trust." "Luke," she said, getting straight to the point, "the trade route to Cheyenne is getting rough. I need someone to patrol it, to show that the law in Dry Creek has teeth now." She held out a small, silver star, a deputy's badge. "It would only be temporary, until I can hire a permanent man." Luke looked at the star gleaming in her palm. It represented everything he had spent his life avoiding: a tie to a town, a duty, a public role. He was a man of the shadows, of the quiet places. He looked past her, toward the small cabin at the edge of town, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. He thought of the woman inside, of a gentle kiss that tasted of hope. Ruth waited, watching his face. He looked back at the badge, then at her, his expression unreadable. He did not give her an answer. The snows melted, and a hesitant green returned to the valley. The bitter wind of autumn was replaced by a soft, warm breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and new life. Spring came to Dry Creek not with a sudden burst, but with a quiet, steady persistence, like a patient hand unfurling. The sagebrush sprouted tender new leaves, and the absarokas, once a wall of forbidding purple, now seemed to embrace the valley under a soft blue haze. The town decided to hold a spring planting festival, a celebration of resilience and new beginnings. Once again, the barn was filled with light and music, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. The light from the kerosene lamps seemed warmer, the music from the fiddles sweeter. There was no undercurrent of fear, no whispers lurking in the shadows. The laughter was genuine, the smiles were easy, and the air hummed with the quiet energy of a community that had faced its own darkness and chosen to step into the light. At the head of a long trestle table laden with food stood May Caldwell. She was not an outcast hiding by the door, but the guest of honor, presiding over a mountain of her own pies, cakes, and biscuits. The townspeople crowded around her, not with stares of judgment, but with plates in their hands and praise on their lips. Dr. Miller, his face softened with a humility he had never shown before, declared her apple pie to be the finest medicine in the territory. Silas, the saloon owner, bought a whole chocolate cake, insisting it was for his customers, though everyone saw him cut a large slice for himself first. Sheriff Ruth Avery, her new badge pinned proudly to her coat, moved through the crowd with a confident grace. The retired Sheriff Miller sat contentedly in a corner, tapping his foot to the music, a mug of cider in his hand, his face peaceful for the first time in years. And near the fiddlers, his face bright with joy, sat Jamie. He was no longer a sickly, frightened boy, but a strong apprentice with a smudge of soot on his cheek that he was too happy to notice. He put a harmonica to his lips, and a sweet, simple melody joined the lively music of the fiddles. Luke Harper stood where he always seemed to stand, near the edge of things, leaning against a newly raised support column. He was quiet, watchful, but the distance was different now. It was not the self-imposed exile of a stranger, but the comfortable stillness of a man at peace in his own place. He was a part of the tapestry now, a vital, anchoring thread. He watched May as she laughed, her face illuminated by the lamplight, and the weary sadness that had always lived in the back of his eyes was gone. As the fiddlers struck up a familiar waltz, he pushed himself off the column. He walked toward her, and this time, the crowd did not fall silent. They parted for him, smiling, nodding, making a clear path. He stopped before May, who was wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. He did not remove his hat this time. He did not need the grand gesture. He simply held out his hand. A slow smile spread across her face. "Time to count," she asked softly, her voice for his ears alone. He smiled back, that rare, beautiful smile that was hers. 1, 2, 3, he said. She placed her hand in his, and he led her to the center of the floor. They began to dance, their steps easy and sure, a perfect, unspoken rhythm between them. And this time, there were no whispers. There were no cold stares. There was only the warm, enveloping sound of a community celebrating, of friends and neighbors tapping their feet, their faces filled with a quiet, healing joy. They were just a man and a woman, dancing in the light, their long, silent waiting finally at an end. As they turned, a breeze from the open barn doors stirred the air, carrying the scent of the greening prairie. High above them, tied to a nail on a freshly sawn rafter, a small, faded length of blue ribbon fluttered. It was a tiny scrap of color in the vastness of the barn, a quiet promise made and kept, a silent testament to a love that had come not like a prairie fire, but like a deep, life-giving spring discovered in the desert. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know where you are tuning in from in the comments to connect with fellow fans. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help us share it with more listeners.